The following recording was taken during Dr. William Lane Craig's 2012 visit to the University of St Andrews in Scotland of Great Britain. Here he delivered a talk to the Students' Christian Union for their opening Freshers' Week of the academic year on the evidence for Christianity, followed by a question and answer period. The copyright for the content of this recording is owned by Dr. William Lane Craig.
Thank you all very much for coming. I hope you're enjoying your food. It's a great pleasure that we have Professor William Lane Craig coming to speak to us today. William Lane Craig is currently the research professor at the Talbot School of Theology in La Mirada. He holds 2 doctorates, so as a PhD student, I'm already very jealous of his achievements. 30 books, over 100 articles in various journals. We're really glad that he can come here and take a time out of his busy schedule to be with us. He has a great website that I can encourage you all to go to, reasonablefaith.org, which has a lot more than what he's going to be able to speak about in half an hour today. So do log on to that if you have any questions about what's being said. But I'm just going to invite Dr. Craig up, and he's going to tell us about whether or not Christianity is credible.
Okay. Good. Thank you, Peter. It's a delight to be here with you today in St. Andrews. I happened to be in town for a philosophy of physics conference that we just completed yesterday and had a wonderful time of interaction with philosophers from both the United States and around the UK on problems in the philosophy of physics, including the subject of the existence of God, which was discussed quite openly. So it was really a wonderful time. And I'm staying an extra day to be able to share this time with you and then for the talk that will be held this evening. And I think probably St. Andrews is the only place in the world where students would show up at the Christian Union meeting carrying their bag of golf clubs, as I saw a student doing here today. You know you're in St. Andrews when you see that. So it really is good to be here. This is my first visit, and glad to have this time of interaction with you. The great atheist philosopher Bertrand Russell was once asked what he would say if he found himself standing before God on the judgment day, and God were to ask him, "Why didn't you believe in me?" Russell replied, "Not enough evidence, God, not enough evidence." Now, as I travel around North America and Europe, speaking on various university campuses, I think that most of the non-believing university professors that I meet would say pretty much the same thing. And this attitude is in turn communicated to their students. There's not enough evidence. But I want to invite you to think with me a little bit about that today. What do people mean when they say not enough evidence? Not enough for what? Not enough to coerce belief? Not enough to compel someone to become a Christian? Well, I think a lot of people take it that way. I find in my experience that most people are spiritually apathetic. They're either too busy or too unconcerned to be bothered about looking into spiritual things. Or if they are interested in spirituality, they're pursuing alternative spiritualities, such as you have in the so-called New Age movement. But basically, people just can't be bothered to look into the evidence for Christianity. And so I find that most people aren't even acquainted with the evidence for the Christian faith. And this is particularly true for university professors. Now, that might seem at first surprising, given the brilliance of many of these men. But when you think about it, all of us in academia have to specialize in a certain field. And as a result, we're largely ignorant of what goes on outside our area of specialization. So, for example, I know something about philosophy, but I know absolutely nothing about chemical engineering or agriculture or business or whatever. So it's possible to have a perfectly profound knowledge of your area of specialization and yet have little more than an elementary school knowledge of Christianity. When you read the biographies of the world's great atheists, what you discover is that most of them lost their faith when they were around 11 or 12 years of age, and they've never studied it again since. Now think of what that means. That means that most of them reject Christianity on the basis of the objections of a 12-year-old. So when people say, there's not enough evidence, what they really mean is, there's not enough evidence to coerce me out of my indifference and make me believe. If I choose to ignore it, the evidence isn't going to grab me by the lapels and force me to believe. To which I say, well, of course the evidence isn't coercive. But why should it be? You see, the knowledge of God is unique in that the knowledge of God is conditioned by moral and spiritual factors. A spiritually indifferent person can have a perfectly profound knowledge of mathematics or Russian literature or sociology or biology or even theology. But a spiritually indifferent person cannot know God. The Bible says that the knowledge of God is promised to those who diligently seek Him. And so the prophet Jeremiah, for example, said, "You shall seek me, and you shall find me, if you seek for me with all your heart." And Jesus said, "Seek, and you will find. Knock, and the door shall be open. Ask, and it shall be given to you. For he who seeks finds, and to him who knocks it shall be open, and to him who asks it shall be given." In other words, God doesn't force himself upon us. He's given evidence of his reality, which is sufficiently clear for those with an open heart and an open mind, but which is sufficiently vague so as not to compel those whose hearts are closed. The great French mathematician Blaise Pascal, who had a dramatic Christian conversion experience at the age of 31, put it in the following way. Pascal said, willing to be seen openly by those who seek him with all their heart, and to be hidden from those who flee from him with all their heart, God has given indications of himself which are visible to those who seek him, but not to those who do not seek him. There is enough evidence for those to see who only desire to see, but enough obscurity for those who have a contrary disposition. In other words, what Pascal was saying is that the evidence is there for those who have eyes to see. So, while the evidence for Christian faith is admittedly not enough to coerce you if your heart and mind are closed, that's not really the interesting question, is it? The really interesting question is there sufficient evidence to ground faith rationally? And the answer to that question is yes, there certainly is. The arguments for the existence of God and the evidences of Christianity may not be coercive, but they are certainly sufficient to ground faith rationally if you're just willing to look at them with an open mind and an open heart. Take, for example, this question of the existence of God. Over the last half century or so, there has been literally a revolution in Anglo-American philosophy with respect to this question. Back in the 1930s and 40s, it was widely believed among philosophers that talk about God was meaningless, literal gibberish. To say, God loves you and has a wonderful plan for your life is as meaningless as saying, "'Twas brillig, and the slithy toves did gyre and gimble in the wabe." Just complete nonsense. This movement reached its crescendo in the mid-1960s with the so-called Death of God movement in American theology. On April 8, 1966, Time magazine carried an infamous cover story for which the cover was completely black except for 3 words emblazoned in bright red letters against the dark background. And the words read, "Is God dead?" And it described the movement among contemporary theologians to proclaim the death of God. Ironically, however, at the very time that the theologians were writing God's obituary, a new generation of young philosophers was discovering God's vitality. Just a few years after its Death of God issue, Time carried another red on black cover story. Only this time, the question read, "Is God coming back to life?" And that's how it must have seemed to those theological morticians of the 1960s. During the 70s, interest in philosophy of religion continued to gather momentum. And by 1980, Time found itself running another major story entitled "Refurbishing the Case for God," in which it described the movement among contemporary philosophers to redefend and formulate all of the traditional arguments for God's existence. According to the article, the noted American philosopher Roderick Chisholm believed that the reason that atheism was so influential a generation ago is because the brightest philosophers at that time were atheists. But today, he said, many of the brightest philosophers are theists, and they are using a kind of tough-minded intellectualism in defense of that belief that was formerly lacking on their side of the debate. In the year 2001, in the secular philosophy journal Philo, the atheist philosopher Quentin Smith wrote an article in which he lamented what he called the desecularization that has been going on in philosophy since the late 1960s. He concludes his article by saying, "God is not dead in academia. He is alive and well in his last academic stronghold, philosophy departments." And so I'm very pleased to be able to inform you today that many of Great Britain and America's finest philosophers at our most prestigious universities are outspoken Christians. I think of people like Richard Swinburne and Brian Leftow at Oxford University, Alvin Plantinga and Peter Van Inwagen at the University of Notre Dame, Dean Zimmerman at Rutgers University, Eleanor Stump at St. Louis University, Trenton Merricks at Virginia, Dallas Willard at USC. I could go on and on. The idea that Christians are intellectual losers and nincompoops is an idea that is just rooted in ignorance and needs to be once and for all decisively put behind us. Now, in my own work as a philosopher, I have focused upon arguments for the existence of God. And I believe that as we probe the natural world, we encounter, as it were, signposts of transcendence, pointing beyond the natural world to its ground in a supernatural reality. And I'll be talking more about that in my talk this evening on Is the Material World All There Is? But just to mention briefly today a couple of these signposts. First of all, the evidence for the Big Bang origin of the universe points to the creation of the universe by a transcendent being beyond space and time. According to Alex Vilenkin, one of the world's most prominent cosmologists, all of the evidence that we have today suggests that the universe had a beginning. And I find that most students and laymen don't understand that according to the Big Bang Theory, not simply all matter and energy, but even physical space and time came into being at the moment of the Big Bang. In the words of the physicist P.C.W. Davies, the Big Bang represents the creation event, the creation of not only all the matter and energy in the universe, but of space-time itself. And that raises the obvious question, why did the universe come to exist? Unless you're willing to say that the universe just popped into existence, uncaused, out of nothing, there has to be a transcendent cause beyond the universe which brought it into being. And by the very nature of the case, this would have to be a beginningless, immaterial, spaceless, timeless being of enormous power. Moreover, and here we come to the second signpost I wanted to briefly mention, the fine-tuning of the initial conditions of the universe for intelligent life points to this cause's being a personal, intelligent mind which designed and created the universe. During the last half-century or so, physicists have been stunned by the discovery that the initial conditions present in the Big Bang itself were fine-tuned for the existence and evolution of intelligent life with a delicacy and precision that is literally incomprehensible. It is so fine in its precision and complexity. For example, to give just one illustration, the so-called cosmological constant, which drives the acceleration of the expanding universe, is fine-tuned to 1 part out of 10 to the power of 120, a number which is so incomprehensible that to call it astronomical would be a wild understatement. There is no physical reason why these constants and quantities present in the Big Bang have the values that they do. Now, sometimes people have tried to avoid the inference that this is the result of an intelligent designer by saying, well, if the universe were not fine-tuned for our existence, then we wouldn't be here to be surprised about it. Given that we are here, we should expect the universe to be fine-tuned for our existence. But I think that the fallacy of this sort of reasoning can be illustrated by means of a parallel analogy. Imagine that you were traveling abroad in some third world country and you were arrested on trumped up drug charges and dragged in front of a firing squad of 100 trained marksmen, all with rifles aimed at your heart. You hear the command given, ready, aim, fire! And you hear the deafening roar of the guns. And then you observe that you're still alive, that all of the 100 marksmen missed. Now, what would you conclude? Well, guess I really shouldn't be surprised that they all missed. After all, if they hadn't all missed, I wouldn't be here to be surprised about it. Given that I am here, I should have expected them all to miss. Well, of course not. You would immediately suspect that they all missed on purpose, that the whole thing was a setup, engineered for some reason by someone. And in exactly the same way, given the incomprehensible improbability of the fine-tuning of the initial conditions of the universe for intelligent life, it is rational to believe that this is not the result of chance, but of design. Now, much more needs to be said about this, but in our brief time together today, I hope this is sufficient to indicate why I say it is certainly rational to believe that there is a personal creator and designer of the cosmos. But what about belief in the Christian God? Is there enough evidence to believe in Jesus as the Gospels portray him? Well, Jesus of Nazareth has certainly become the storm center of controversy in our day, hasn't he? As radical biblical critics, like those in the so-called Jesus Seminar, have claimed that less than 20% of the words attributed to Jesus in the Gospels are really authentic, that is to say, actually spoken by the historical Jesus. When you check out the evidence, however, a very different picture emerges than the one painted by the radical critics. In fact, today, most historical scholars believe that Jesus of Nazareth came on the scene with an unprecedented sense of divine authority, the authority to stand and to speak in God's place, and that his visible demonstrations of the inbreaking of God's kingdom into history in his person, he carried out a ministry of miracle working and exorcisms. Now, Jesus was either who he claimed to be, or else he was a blasphemous megalomaniac, which just seems really implausible. But there's more to this story, for we have dramatic historical confirmation of those radical personal claims whereby Jesus put himself in God's place, namely his resurrection from the dead. Now, I realize that most people would think that the resurrection of Jesus is something you just believe in, by faith or not. But in fact, today the majority of New Testament historians who have investigated this problem are agreed that, number one, after his crucifixion, Jesus was interred in a tomb by a man named Joseph of Arimathea. Number two, that tomb was then found empty by a group of his women followers on the Sunday morning after his crucifixion. Three, that thereafter various individuals and groups of people, under a variety of circumstances, experienced appearances of Jesus alive after his death. And fourthly, that the disciples' belief in Jesus' resurrection was not the result of their faith in him, but quite the contrary. Their faith in him was the result of their having come to believe that God had raised him from the dead. So these are the facts. The only question is, how do you best explain them? Well, here, the skeptical critic faces a rather desperate situation, frankly. For example, a few years ago, I had a debate at the University of California, Irvine, with a professor who had written his doctoral dissertation on the evidence for Jesus' resurrection. And he was thoroughly familiar with the evidence, and he could not deny the historical facts of Jesus' burial in the tomb, the discovery of the empty tomb, the post-mortem appearances of Jesus, and the origin of the disciples' belief in Jesus' resurrection. And so, his only recourse was to come up with some alternative explanation of those four facts. And so, he argued that Jesus of Nazareth must have had an unknown identical twin brother who was separated from him at birth, who grew up independently, came back to Jerusalem just at the time of the crucifixion, stole Jesus' body out of the tomb, and presented himself to the disciples who mistakenly thought that Jesus was risen from the dead. Now, I'm not going to go into how I went about refuting this theory. You can listen to the debate on our website if you want. But I think that this is illustrative because it shows to what desperate lengths skepticism must go in order to explain away the evidence for Jesus' resurrection. In fact, the evidence is so good that, did you know, one of the world's leading Jewish theologians, the late Pinchas Lapid, who taught at Hebrew University in Israel, declared himself convinced on the basis of the evidence that the God of Israel had raised Jesus from the dead. Now, again, much more deserves to be said about this. But again, I think enough has been said to indicate why I say the Christian is certainly within his rational rights if he believes that Jesus rose from the dead and therefore was who he claimed to be. So, while the evidence for Christian faith is admittedly not enough to coerce you if your heart and mind are closed, I think it is certainly sufficient to ground faith rationally, if you're just willing to look at it with an open mind and an open heart. Now, our whole discussion here this afternoon has presupposed that becoming a Christian is a matter of weighing the evidence for and against Christian faith and then making up your mind. But when you think about it, there's surely something wrong with that assumption. A loving God wouldn't leave it up to us to work out by our own devices on the basis of our own cleverness and ingenuity whether or not he exists. Rather, a loving God would himself pursue us and seek to draw us to himself. And this is exactly what the Bible says God has done. Jesus said, "When I am lifted up, I will draw all men to myself." And again, Jesus said, "No man comes to me unless the Father who sent me draws him." So, when I said earlier that in order to find God, you need to diligently seek him, that wasn't really the whole story. From a human perspective, that's true. But from the wider perspective, it's really God who is seeking you. And it's up to you whether or not you're going to open your heart to his grace and love, or whether you shut yourself off against his love and forgiveness. I mentioned earlier that when Pascal was 31 years of age, he had a dramatic conversion experience whereby he became a Christian. That experience marked Pascal's entire life. When he died, they found sewn into his clothing a reminder of that event that he always carried with him. And this is what it said. From about 10:30 at night until 12:30, fire, God of Abraham, God of Isaac, God of Jacob, not of the philosophers and of the learned, certitude, feeling, joy, peace, Jesus Christ, let me never be separated from him. Arguments and evidence can help, but in the end you have to come to grips, as Pascal discovered, not simply with arguments, but with the living Lord himself. Well, I think we've got some time for discussion. So let me invite you to ask any question or raise any issue that you would like to, and I'll do my best to respond. Yes?
You talked a bit earlier about knowing God and presenting it, I think, mainly as kind of propositional truths, like seeking the truth,
Yes.
finding it, things like that. You talked a bit about the way in which like knowledge is equated almost with love. Say like 1 Corinthians 8 or something like that. With he who knows hasn't known properly unless he knows God. And this idea, and tied in with your ending there about
Yes.
God loving you first, or seeking you first.
Yes, I'm glad that you said that it does tie in with what I did try to conclude. St. Paul says in 1 Corinthians 8 that knowledge puffs up, but love builds up. If anyone thinks that he knows something, he does not yet know as he ought to know. And I think what Paul is saying there is that in God's economy, love is more important than knowledge. Now, they're not mutually exclusive. Paul was a brilliant intellectual himself, and he believed in the truth that God exists and that we can know that truth. But ultimately, Christian faith is not just about believing a set of doctrines or a set of propositions, is it? It's about personal knowledge, coming to know God in a personal way. To illustrate, imagine that you're a single person and that someone with a crystal ball could give you a picture of the woman or the man that someday you will marry. And you could know all about this person. You could know her interests, her looks, her intelligence, what she's done as a career, and all of that. You could know all about her, but you really wouldn't know her. In fact, you might look at the crystal ball and say, wow, I can't wait to get to know her. So that's the kind of knowledge that ultimately counts, not just the propositional knowledge of facts about God, but knowing God in that personal and intimate way. And that's exactly why, as I said at the end, the knowledge of God is something that is incomplete until it is that personal acquaintance with God coming into relationship with himself. Yes, way in the back. Nice and loud so I can hear you, please.
How would you recommend Christians who are interested in persuading people of the gospel engage and talk with people who would say themselves that their hearts are closed and who aren't interested?
People who are closed, did you say?
How these Christians talk to people who say themselves that they're closed?
That they are closed. Yeah, my best shot at this, and this is very difficult because if a person is apathetic, it's very difficult to engage them. My best shot at this is to explain what I call the absurdity of life without God. I have found in reading existentialist, atheist philosophers like Jean-Paul Sartre and Albert Camus that one has a picture of the human predicament which is more poignant than anything a Christian might have painted. Read the works of these atheist existentialists themselves. For Sartre and Camus, life without God is ultimately absurd. That is to say, it is without ultimate meaning. Everything will perish in the heat death of the universe. Nothing has any significance ultimately. There is no ultimate value in life in the absence of God to serve as an absolute anchor point for moral values. Moral values become just socioculturally relative, and there is no basis for the affirmation of objective moral values and duties, and life becomes ultimately purposeless. There is no goal for human existence. There is no reason you exist. And the response of these philosophers to this human predicament is despair. It leads ultimately to utter despair. And if you can get the apathetic person to feel the despair of the non-Christian life and the meaninglessness and valuelessness and purposelessness of life, that may motivate that person to begin to seek and say, well, wait a minute, maybe the atheistic view isn't true after all. Maybe there really is a God and there really is hope and so forth. This was what Pascal did. Pascal's work, the Pensée, is a brilliant exposition of the human predicament apart from God. In Pascal's day, French libertines only sought for pleasure and entertainment. They cared nothing about God. And Pascal tried to show the despair and the meaninglessness and the absurdity of life if God does not exist. So the writings of people like Nietzsche, Pascal, Bertrand Russell, Sartre, Camus, I think, are a real help in that way. And in my own work, such as my book On Guard, or Reasonable Faith, I begin with a chapter on the absurdity of life without God to try to awaken in the unbeliever a sense of the importance of this question and to shake him out of his apathy. Beyond that, I think all one can do is befriend that person, pray for him, be a friend to him, and show that he's not just a spiritual scalp that you're trying to seek, but someone you really care about, and hope that in time God's Spirit will open his heart. Yes?
Well, from your perspective, do you think that Pascal's wager can be a valid approach to secular culture still today?
The question was, do I think Pascal's wager can be a valuable approach? I do think, within limits, his wager argument can be useful. Now, what is this argument? As I said, Pascal was writing to these French libertines who loved gambling and games of chance. And so he devises this argument where he says, look, if God exists, well, let's start with if he does not exist. If you're right and God does not exist, then in banking on believing in God, I've lost nothing except maybe the pleasures of sin for a season in this life. But I've lost only a finite amount by banking on God if I'm wrong. But he says, suppose God does exist, then you have lost eternal life and suffered infinite loss, whereas I will have infinite gain. And so the infinite gain to be had by believing in God simply swamps the finite loss that you would have if you're incorrect. And so Pascal said, you should wager on God. You should bet and believe that God does exist. Now, the problem with Pascal's argument is that that same argument could be launched by a Muslim or a Mormon or some other non-Christian belief, and pretty soon you proliferate the alternatives so much that you're not sure which one to bet on. But for the person who is convinced that the alternative is either naturalism or Christianity, he's narrowed the options down, and he thinks, yeah, it's either Christianity or naturalism. For that kind of person, I think the wager argument is a good one. And it does show that for pragmatic reasons, belief in God would be justified. And this was Pascal's own approach. When you read the Pensées, he presents historical arguments for the resurrection of Jesus, rather similar to what I shared a few moments ago. So Pascal thought that you could give some positive reasons for Christian belief that might narrow the options down enough for then the wager argument to go through. Yes, way in the back.
I feel that our generation as a whole has definitely moved more
Louder, please.
I feel that our generation as a whole has definitely, I feel that we've moved towards wanting to experience God, as opposed to, say, a previous generation who would be more looking for solid reasons of why God exists and evidence of why we should believe. So how would you address that? How would you react to people searching for God, but not for solid reasons, but for the experience?
Well, I speak on a lot of university campuses, and I think the idea that students are not interested in hearing a rational basis for faith is a myth. One of the things I typically do will be to have debates on university campuses with non-Christian professors on topics like, does God exist? Or did Jesus rise from the dead? I just did a tour of universities in England last October. Every venue at which I spoke, even though they sold tickets for these things, I mean, you had to pay to get in, everyone was sold out. They were crammed. I find there's tremendous interest among students in hearing a rational discussion of the pros and cons for believing in the existence of God and Christian faith. As long as there's a level playing field where both sides are presented equally, I think there's great interest in that. So I think that there is a lot of interest in hearing the arguments and evidence. And on the other side of the coin, I'm sure you're aware of this, that in a country like Britain, thousands, if not millions of students walk away from Christian faith because they're convinced by people like Richard Dawkins and Christopher Hitchens that there's nothing intellectually to Christian faith, and so they become atheists or agnostics. And so secularism in Britain has been incredibly on the rise over the last century. So you see both the students who hear the good reasons, interested in and responding to them. On the other hand, you hear students walking away from Christian faith because all it has in their mind is emotional appeals and no intellectual substance. So I think both of those are testimony to the fact that we as Christians need to be doing exactly what the Scripture commands us to do. Always be ready to give a reason to anyone who asks you for the hope that is in you with gentleness and reverence. 1 Peter 3:15. Yes?
People like Richard Dawkins, I think, if I understand, have refused to debate with you. And so with that in mind and where that big new atheist movement is going, where do you see that going if it's not engaging with what you're saying?
The comment was that Professor Dawkins has repeatedly and resolutely declined to participate in a debate with me. He was invited by the British Humanist Association, as well as, I think, 3 other independent organizations last October to participate in a debate, and he resolutely refused to do so. And that despite an earlier statement by him that he would be willing to debate anyone at any time, and I will win. He said, I will show you that your arguments are no good. And he wouldn't man up in this case. I think that the new atheism is a spent force culturally. I think that it may continue to roll forward for a time under its own inertia, but it's a spent force. Its intellectual credibility has been removed. Other atheists like Michael Roos and Daniel Keem and others have criticized books like The God Delusion or Christopher Hitchens' books, and they have not then provided substantive responses. Instead, they've simply called names and launched personal attacks. So I believe that the new atheism, which was always a pop cultural movement, quite different from that movement I described in my talk, that revolution in Anglo-American philosophy, which is going on in the top tier of the academy. This pop cultural movement called the new atheism, I think is running out of steam, and the momentum is going to change soon.
One last question?
Yes, here's one.
How would you suggest a believer engages someone who is convinced that God does not exist because of certain personal tragedies in their life? So they're more of an active bitterness.
Right. How would one deal with a person who is an unbeliever because of personal tragedies in that person's life? I think there are two levels on which to deal with this. One is the philosophical level, and one is the emotional level. And I think that we need to help the person to see that what he's struggling with is probably an emotional problem rather than an intellectual problem. And you can read work on the problem of evil, as it's called, or the problem of suffering that has been done by philosophers. For example, in my book On Guard, I have a chapter on the problem of suffering and evil in the world, and examine that from an intellectual perspective. Does this provide any kind of disproof of God? And I try to show how it really doesn't mount a good disproof of God intellectually, that it makes assumptions that are so far beyond the evidence that it would lay a burden of proof on the atheist's shoulder that is just unsustainable. And what that means is then that the problem of suffering and evil as an obstacle to belief is really an emotional problem. And then that needs to be dealt with accordingly on an emotional level. And what I would do is point a person to the person of Christ. Christ on the cross has endured the most excruciating suffering for you, even though he was utterly innocent. If anyone could complain of the problem of innocent suffering, it would be Jesus of Nazareth. And yet he voluntarily took upon this horrible, excruciating death. And why? Because he loves you so much, to bring you back to God, to reconcile you to God. And when we contemplate his love and the depth of the suffering that he was willing to undertake on our behalf, I think that can give us the strength and the courage to bear the cross that he asks us to bear in this finite lifetime, with a view toward an infinite recompense in heaven that is beyond all comparison and comprehension in relation to the suffering that we now have. So that would be the basic approach that I would try to take with such a person, is to try to help them to see there's not an intellectual problem here, there's an emotional problem here, and then try to deal with it on an emotional basis. Well, thank you very much. It's been good to be with you, and I hope that we'll see many of you back tonight.
Thank you very much, everyone, for coming. There are loads more events on this week by the Christian Union. The Christian Union is very keen to make sure that every student can understand that Christianity is credible and has an opportunity to understand more. So if you meet a CU member, do ask them what their story is about. If you need any more help with literature, there's always Dr. Craig's reasonablefaith.org website. He's speaking again today at 7 o'clock in Physics Lecture Theatre A. And as I said, do make contact with the Christian Union. We'd love to give you a Bible. We'd love to invite you along to loads more events. So please don't leave this opportunity. Christianity is credible, and we would love to share that with you. Thanks for coming.